studied development economics or political economy of industrial Asia, then you will know that Taiwan, both historically and in the present tense, is one of, in many ways, the most interesting economies in Asia from my vantage point, both because of the model and the unique ecosystem that it developed, and also because some of the challenges, both legacy challenges and future-oriented challenges that it faces. So in that spirit, we're here to release this new paper. We left copies out in the hallway, and you can find it online as well, called Assuring Taiwan's Innovation Future. But as you'll see from the cover, that flags a series title, Assuring Taiwan's Future Economic Competitiveness. And from the blurb inside, it's part of a longer-term effort that we're now making here at Carnegie to blend more political economy and technology policy-related work into our Asia programming across the platform. I've been here only about a year. We have always had very strong work on security policy across the Indo-Pacific, but we're doing more and more rebalancing of the program to include these other aspects of the Asian story. Mike is a big part of that build out here at Carnegie generally. Our center in New Delhi that you see up here, I'd say about 40–50% of the work in New Delhi now is on things like data localization, data privacy, technology work, political economy work. So in that spirit, we're trying to look at Asia in a somewhat more robust and multidimensional way than I think we have in terms of our legacy. So as part of that, we decided that we would take a look at this very interesting economy, as I was saying, Taiwan, by taking a multi-step, multi-project deep dive into, as the series title says, the future of Taiwan's economic competitiveness, because that's a question of Taiwan's future security. It's closely tied to its long-term economic competitiveness, but also because we're facing an era where there's going to be a lot of technological change, global economic disruption, and political risk, not just to Taiwan, but to really every major economy around the world. So we wanted to take one place, this very interesting economy, and do a multi-step deep dive to look at both what had worked for Taiwan in the past, some of the legacy issues, and then also how a place like Taiwan could deal with, as I said, technological, economic, and political disruption. Now, if you've seen the data that's just come out for 2019, you could easily be impressed. Taiwan grew by 2.73% for the year. It grew even more robustly, over 3.25% for the last quarter of 2019. And so at one level, Taiwan has a pretty robust economic story to tell. It's also having a pretty good trade war in terms of trade diversion as a result of what's happening between the United States and China. For instance, diversion back to Taiwan for production to avoid US tariffs on product from China. And partly as a result of that, as I said, the economy is growing pretty robustly. A lot of companies are reinvesting, including marquee companies in Taiwan. TSMC is one example, Pegatron, there are others. But what we really, there was an animating premise for this work, which was that while Taiwan might have the right economy for right now, the real challenge is not to have the right economy for right now, but for 10 to 15 years from now. And the further out you pull that thread, the more there's going to be a premium on forward-thinking initiatives, both around the nature of the workforce, the nature of the industrial mix, and how an economy positions itself for the future. So that was the general item and concept of the project. And in terms of the innovation piece of it, we started with a basic historical proposition, which was that, number one, innovation had been a source of comparative advantage for Taiwan historically. You can see that in Taiwan's extraordinary story in semiconductor and chip design, and with companies like TSMC and MediaTek and so on. But also that it had been an important basis for trans-Pacific links between Taiwan and the United States, and particularly the kind of brain circulation that characterized the relationship between Taiwan and Silicon Valley in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. But as we jumped into this project, and we did it in partnership with the WTO and RTA Center at the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research, which is a leading economics think tank in Taiwan, what we found is that both of those historical legacies, being innovative and also these trans-Pacific partnerships, faced a new series of challenges. For one thing, and this is the story that I think is best known, the manufacturing ecosystem in Taiwan has really been hollowed out in some sectors. So much of the information and communications technology device manufacturing and also design has moved across the Taiwan Strait to mainland China that, according to Ministry of Economic Affairs data, 80% of ICT devices now that have Taiwan origin are basically manufactured with mainland China content. But that's actually not the most interesting part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is that fostering a startup sector in Taiwan that would replace those losses in manufacturing had been much more challenging than I think some of the popular narrative presumes. In other words, Taiwan has an incredibly vital startup sector. It's got amazing private sector incubators, accelerators. The government is very focused on this, the 5+2 Innovative Industries Plan, and so on. But even with this vital startup sector, internationalization had proved to be a pretty persistent challenge for the startups that have emerged in Taiwan in recent decades. So too few of Taiwan's startups were really international in either orientation or in the nature of their partnerships. And what's more, too few of them were in technology-related industries. In other words, because they weren't in technology-related industries, they couldn't simply swap back in. And I'll just give you an example that we talk about a little bit in the report. PwC did a survey of the startup ecosystem in Taiwan, and it found that while 70% of Taiwan startups had been founded by first-time founders, which is an interesting data point, only 1/3 of those founders have educational backgrounds actually in engineering, science, or information technology industries. Nearly 60% of all startup founders in Taiwan have backgrounds in the liberal arts or in business. And nearly twice as many startup founders have backgrounds in marketing as in all of the sciences combined. So it starts to tell you something about the nature of the emerging ecosystem that we're seeing in Taiwan. So with that as kind of the historical basis, what we and our partners from Zhonghua tried to do was to gather a bunch of stakeholders really on both sides of the Pacific. Video conferencing technology is an amazing thing. We had people in Silicon Valley, we had people in Taipei, we had people here on the East Coast. And to take a deep dive again into what had worked for Taiwan historically, what some of the challenges were that we could see, not for right now, but as we projected 5 to 10 years down the road. And then to be highly prescriptive in brainstorming ideas across industry, government, and capital markets players about how Taiwan, with an assist from the United States through new US-Taiwan partnerships, could try to deal with some of those emerging challenges that we saw. So I think what I'm gonna do, let me talk a little bit about some of that historical background briefly, and then I'll talk about these 5 buckets of challenge that our group really began to focus on. And then it's hard to do justice to the report, so I encourage you to look at it, but there are all kinds of prescriptive recommendations in here. Some are for government, some are for both sides of the Pacific, some are for industry, but particularly because Alexa represents industry, I'm gonna let Alexa handle more of the prescriptive part of this, and I'll just talk about some of the structural challenges. Now first, on Taiwan as a model. As I said at the beginning, when I was a graduate student at Stanford 25, 30 years ago in a PhD program, if you studied the rise of industrial Asia, Taiwan was an incredibly interesting political economy and development economic story. And to those who say there's an East Asian development model as if that's a unitary thing, studying Taiwan is interesting and important because the model and the ecosystem that emerged is in many ways different than what happened in Japan and South Korea, as examples. There really were 3 legs of the Taiwan model that made it so successful. The first, and in many ways I would say most important, was government competition policy. And so you had very forward-thinking technocrats like K.T. Lee, the foundation of institutions like ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, the creation of a very vibrant venture capital industry, forward-thinking investments, and the use of competition policy to create really a market-friendly and much more decentralized model of technology and industry development than you see, for example, in the South Korean model, where there's a nexus between government and a few privileged firms, the so-called chaebol. Taiwan had a much more decentralized model than what you saw in Korea historically in the 1970s and 80s. And one of the members of our convening group, Annalise Saxenian, who's the former dean of the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley, has done really pioneering research both on the political economy of technology development in Taiwan and also the political economy of technology development in Silicon Valley. And some of the features that worked in the Valley, decentralization, market-friendly structures, that was recreated in Taiwan. Now, that's not a surprise because of the second leg of this three-legged stool that worked in Taiwan, and that was internationalization. Taiwan, in effect, as Anna's work shows, discovered Silicon Valley in many ways before the rest of the world did. And if you look at how the semiconductor industry developed, the fact that transplants like Morris Chang, who founded TSMC, who came out of Texas Instruments, came out of US firms, you had this extraordinary connection across the Pacific in the 1960s and 70s between Taiwanese who had worked in the Valley, worked in the United States, that created this intensive, persistent connection between California in particular, but the United States generally, and Taiwan across the Pacific. These were people who eventually went back to Taiwan, having advised the government. In many cases, they founded their own firms. They were important founts of advice for the government on creating the initial sprouts of the semiconductor and chip design industry in Taiwan. And so they created, in many ways, the model. But the point is, internationalization was incredibly important to Taiwan's development, not just internationalization for export, but internationalization in terms of this process of what we call, and Anna called, brain circulation, that linked the Taiwan ecosystem to the California ecosystem, the US ecosystem beyond. And that's really the legacy that created so many of the connections between Hsinchu in Taiwan on the one hand and Silicon Valley on the other, and also created some of the first sprouts of the hardware industry in Taiwan. Now, the third leg, of course, was innovation in Taiwan itself. Taiwan quickly went beyond its cheap labor advantage to become a source of innovation, quality production, efficiency, and to scale, particularly through the foundry model that developed, that really diversified the way that business functioned from vertically integrated firms. Really a pioneering way of developing industry there. And so this three-legged stool of government competition policy, intensive internationalization and brain circulation across the Pacific, and then indigenous innovation in Taiwan, particularly in these niche industries, really was a big part of what made Taiwan so successful. And I would really stress internationalization, integration into global supply chains, but also integration into global knowledge ecosystems. It wasn't just about industry and production, it was about knowledge, R&D, and research. It made Taiwan extraordinarily special, successful, and an interesting place to study. Now that brings us to some of the challenges that we see today. And we lay these out in the report in much more detail than I will here. A lot has happened in the last 20 years, and I think Taiwan's been buffeted by change in its really two most important external economic relationships, one set with mainland China and the other with the United States. With China, as I said, so much of both R&D and production for export, integration into supply chains moved across to the other side of the strait. Shenzhen, in particular, has this very unique manufacturing ecosystem now that is not just about cheap labor advantage anymore. It's also about quick logistics, very fast production times. If you want to, prototype a hardware product, turn it around, tweak it, retweak it, do it on very short production cycles. In many ways, Shenzhen offers an ecosystem that's become particularly unique. That's beyond the scope of this paper, but there are other people that have written on that. So that's how Shenzhen partly became this wonderland of sort of mid-scale hardware that you see today. But the relationship with the US and the way the Taiwan-US relationship has changed, I think in many ways is more interesting and important. Because the brain circulation that I described before was so persistently important to Taiwan's success in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. One place to look at that is really to take a look at what's happened to the education partnerships between Taiwan and the United States. Taiwan faces a little bit of a talent gap today, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but to put it bluntly, there's less brain circulation going on between Taiwan and the US than there was in the past. There are less Taiwan students studying here before. More of them stay here and they don't go home, particularly at the graduate level. And so that's partly what new, forward-thinking, new generation US-Taiwan educational partnerships, which we put some stress on in the report, would be designed to deal with. So let me start to put up some of these slides as a way of looking at some of these things. When our group took a look at some of the challenges across the board that really were defining the challenges Taiwan was facing, we focused on 5 in particular. One is the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics talent pool that Taiwan will have. And again, not for right now, but for 10 to 15 years from now. And the reality is that Taiwan faces significant obstacles in its effort to assure a robust and growing STEM talent pool, particularly because there's so much more competition for STEM talent among so many more economies. This chart is an interesting example of that, and I'm going to come back to it in a second, but let me just, so you see where I'm going with this, lay out the 5 challenges. So one is how to assure a STEM talent pool. And in many ways, our group thought this was really the #1 challenge that Taiwan is facing. Second is problems of scale. It's tough to be a small economy. It's particularly tough to be a small economy in some of the industries that are emerging for the future that need to leverage data. Big data is a big part of the story. It's not the whole story, but in a lot of industries it is. And China in particular has been able to leverage that to its advantage. Taiwan has a legacy ecosystem that's heavily dominated by hardware. And in some ways, it's a victim of its own success, because if you think about industries of the future, they begin with hardware, but increasingly they're about hardware-software integration. Drone technology is a good example. We asked ourselves in this group, how could Taiwan get more of the value added to reside in Taiwan? So that industry for the future would leave more of the value added in Taiwan itself. And finally, what could the government do in terms of policy enhancements? So those were sort of the 5 challenges that we identified. Now, STEM talent is an interesting one because Taiwan has such a talented and well-educated population. But the reality, to be blunt about it, is fourfold. One, Taiwan is in fact producing fewer science, technology, and engineering and mathematics graduates than in the past. Second, many of the graduates in engineering that it is producing are really concentrated in legacy fields, by which I mean electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, not in future-oriented fields like computer science and data science. And if you look at this chart, for instance, you can see the number of engineers have been shrinking in recent years, but the more interesting part is basically what's happened in computer science, where basically it's been flat over many years. So Taiwan is producing fewer engineers, but also not enough of the engineers, and it's not rising fast enough in the fields that are really going to be at the heart of industries like AI for the future, by which I mean computer science and data science. Third, there are fewer Taiwan students coming to the United States, and I'm not sure if I have that chart. Nope, I don't have that chart, so I'll come back to that in a second. Fewer Taiwan students coming to the United States, and of those that do, more of them are staying here. So if you look at PhDs, for example, we have a chart in the report. 3 out of every 4 Taiwan PhDs who get their PhDs in the US stay here in the US, they don't go home. And that's more than ever than in the past. So if you're thinking about how Taiwan builds a future-oriented STEM workforce and talent pool for the future, you need essentially more engineers, more computer and data scientists, more of that brain circulation with the US, and more people going home, as in the past, operating on both sides of the Pacific. And when we looked into the data, we saw on both sides, that Taiwan participants in our group, but also the US participants in our group, some reasons for concern, but the good news is things that the government in Taiwan, in partnership with the United States, could do a lot to help alleviate that. The reality is because of that, there's actually a mismatch between supply and demand for talent if you look out and you pull the thread into the future. This is a study by Oxford Economics that ranked 41 economies. Taiwan ranks dead last out of 41 economies that are in this chart. This chart is not in the report, but this is in terms of matching demand and supply for STEM-enabled, STEM-qualified labor. So this is a challenge that Taiwan is going to face. And we can argue over the scope and scale of the challenge, but the baseline of the challenge is something that obviously has been identified by people in Taiwan as a major challenge going forward. Second problem, therefore, I'll come back to that. Second problem, therefore, is the problem of scale. Taiwan's a small economy, 23 million people, and it's always derived a comparative advantage from globalization, integration into global supply chains, connections to the global economy. And it's still a dominant player on that in many of these legacy areas. In semiconductors, chip design, things that are not just legacies, but really are future-facing, it's absolutely a dominant player, and for good reason. But if you think about some of the industries like artificial intelligence or AI-enabled applications, AI-enabled or cyber-enabled applications for healthcare, for Internet of Things, for agricultural sciences, there are a whole series of metrics you can look at where Taiwan has a problem of scale because it's overcoming the problem of being a small economy. Now, the good news is there are lots of small economies like Israel, for example, that have been able to leverage niche specialization. In Israel's case, it's cyber. Israel's a global cyber hub. to really multiply their advantages and make strategic investments. And in the report, we talk a little bit about some of the things that Israel, Estonia, some other small economies have been able to do to basically leverage an interesting nexus between government policy, industry, and education, and the VC industry in ways that create new specializations that can scale globally. But that's one of the challenges that Taiwan is facing, and you see it particularly acutely in industries like AI. And all of the AI-enabled applications. And a lot of the industry participants in our group, we heard about that quite a lot. I don't want to drone on too much, so I'll just blow quickly through the other three, and you can read more about them in the report. But so many of the industries of the future really are focused on, as I said, not just hardware. They begin with hardware, but ultimately it's about how software and hardware integrate. So having strong hardware advantages and strong software advantages are good, but finding ways to integrate those two is going to be increasingly important. And we talked in the report about some of the industries and how Taiwan could begin to leverage that. For us, the reality is that the identifying sectors and industries is one place to begin. So the good news is that President Tsai Ing-wen's government, with the 5+2 Innovative Industries plans, has picked out a lot of the right sectors. One piece of that is the so-called Asian Silicon Valley plan. Another is smart machinery for next generation original equipment and OED manufacturing. That's all good. But the question is, in a world where there's growing competition in all of those sectors, and where you have a lot of major economies that can put a lot of money and can also leverage scale to position themselves globally in those things, not least the neighbor across the Taiwan Strait, we asked ourselves how Taiwan could define some distinctive and unique comparative advantages for itself. You'll see in the report some references to being a trusted hub, a trusted vendor, a trusted tester, a trusted conduit. These are the kinds of things that we focused on, and there are a lot of prescriptive recommendations in the report that are designed to basically define Taiwan uniquely, particularly at a time when many global firms and international governments have less trust, frankly, in mainland China-created hardware and hardware-software integration products. So, for instance, we encourage the government of Taiwan to create a trusted vendor certification program that could basically define a set of metrics, and Taiwan could become a global testing and a testing hub in a set of industries, and also a vendor for AI and cyber-enabled applications. You'll see more detail on that in the report, but those are the kinds of things that we were trying to look at. We then looked at, as I said, how to leave more of the value added in Taiwan, but above all, there was this question of policy. What could government do in Taiwan, both in terms of innovation strategy, forward-thinking investments, but also international partnerships? Alexa will talk about some of those things, but in particular, there are a whole series of recommendations around public-private partnerships. There are interesting things happening in Taiwan around accelerators, incubators, things that are actually sponsored by industry. But unfortunately, if you look, for example, at the share of public sector spending in Taiwan's overall R&D spend, it's been collapsing over the last couple of decades. So the good news is there's a much larger and more assertive private sector focus on R&D. But we really, in our group, encourage the public sector to do more, particularly to try to resolve some of these timing mismatches in certain industries over time. So anyway, I encourage you to take a look at the report. I was hoping this would be more of a discussion and not just me talking at you. But I mean, I think for me, the punchline is the things that made Taiwan so interesting and successful are all still there. But there's a lot happening around Taiwan in terms of technological change, and as I said, economic disruption before you even get to the questions of political risk. Then you pile in the questions of political risk, not least from Beijing, but also from things like the trade war. And there really is going to be a premium, if you're thinking, as we are in this project, about Taiwan's long-term economic competitiveness, for forward-thinking initiatives in terms of investment, in terms of educational initiatives and in terms of educational and industry partnerships, to try to recreate some of that spirit that existed before, but to compensate for some of the challenges that Taiwan has faced in recent years. And as I said, it's not just about scale, but it is about positioning the labor force, the educational system, and the public-private relationship, and the relationship with the United States and other partners in ways that position Taiwan for success in the face of those challenges over the long term. So we can come back and talk about some of those, but maybe that's a good segue for you to talk a little bit more, Alexa, about some of the prescriptive pieces.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So thank you, Evan. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Alexa Lee. I'm the Senior Manager at Information Technology Industry Council. So just a little bit background about ITI. We are an industry association representing about 70 of the world's biggest technology companies. We have offices in Brussels and have a parent association in Beijing. We have a staff in India and Brazil as well. So we do have global footprint around the world. And we not only represent American companies, but Koreans, Japanese, European, and Taiwanese companies as well. So today, very glad to be here. So today I'm gonna share with you what are some of the opportunities that US and Taiwan can work together in the technology space. And as Evan mentioned, there are a lot of challenges facing Taiwan now, but there are also a lot of opportunities. We all know that traditionally Taiwan has been very strong, in the hardware manufacturing side of things, but now they're just starting to look at, how can we make sure we still win in the future technologies? So I think because of that, I think Taiwan should really, probably start being a little bit active. They cannot just hide behind the scene, keep doing what they do the best, just kind of manufacturing things, keep a low profile. I think that has to change. So if today I have one message for you today, I hope you can bring home with you, is that I think in the ICT space, Taiwan really should start being an active player on the global stage instead of being reactive to current events. So for that, I will structure my remark in 4 policy areas where I feel that the US and Taiwan can deepen their ties in technologies. So they are cybersecurity, emerging technologies such as AI, privacy, and digital trade. So first, I will begin with cybersecurity. So if you have been reading any news about cybersecurity, about tech policy in general, you will notice that there's a lot of discussion around the global supply chain security. And a lot of that discussions have been driven by the concerns about Huawei, about Chinese telecom equipment. Is it safe to have their equipment in the network, or can this kind of cybersecurity risk be mitigated or not? And on the Hill, there's a lot of NDA provisions. They're saying, what are the best practices around supply chain? Can we just simply ban Huawei? Is that gonna solve all the problems? It's a lot of opinions and discussions around this issue, but currently there's no easy solutions yet. But I think in a difficult time like this, Taiwan should really, stand out and prove itself to be a trusted supplier and alternative source that can be reliable to the US as a partner. So for example, I think in the US administration right now, there's kind of a rethinking about its industrial policy, through federal policy, through cybersecurity certifications, through procurement requirements, through the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's just a lot of discussion right now. How can we kind of reframe that industrial policy? So in a time like this, it will be really important for Taiwan. How can they just kind of raise their hand and be like, we are ready to partner with you as soon as you are ready? Those are some of the ideas that Evan talked about as a trusted vendor program. How can Taiwan quickly prove itself as a partner in that way? I think that will be very important. So that's pretty much my first point on cybersecurity. And the second point is I think Taiwan should really position itself as a cybersecurity leader in the Asia-Pacific region. At least you have that kind of ambition. Because I think people probably know that probably every single day, Taiwan is being, having some cyber attack from mainland China. It has a lot of experiences and knowledge how to deal with that kind of cyber threat. So if you look at, for example, Middle East, Israel is such a cybersecurity hub, partnering with the US on a lot of counterterrorism efforts, dealing with cyber threat in that area. And you look at Estonia, is such a small country, but they are so important in dealing with cyber attack from Russia, and they share that kind of information with all their European partners in that kind of atmosphere. So looking back in Asia, Taiwan actually have a lot of great stories and knowledge to share with other Asian countries as well in this regard. And I'm very glad to hear like last year, US and Taiwan actually have a joint cyber exercise. That is definitely a good start, and that kind of exercise should be mirrored into other partnership opportunities in Asia as well. So that's my second point. And the last point on cybersecurity, I think, is this U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy that Secretary Pompeo pushed out last year. So I think they actually call out specifically Taiwan in that document. And if you look at that document, there's actually this cybersecurity partnership pillar under that document. So pretty much U.S. is trying to figure out a way how can they increase U.S. technology export to that region. And I think this policy objective pretty much align with what President Tsai's new southbound policy is also looking at, increase Taiwanese influence in the Southeast Asian countries as well. I see they, pretty much objective pretty much align. So what Taiwan and US can do in that is really seeking opportunities for basic cybersecurity training for the Southeast Asian country. How can they build up their technical capability in those regard, in those industries? I know that, for example, like the Japanese and the South Koreans, they are very active partnering with the US on some of the smart city initiative in Southeast Asia already. So hope Taiwan is not too late in the game. So hopefully they can, get out there and then make sure they do those partnerships with the US. So I think that's pretty much what's my recommendation under the cybersecurity. And so next, I will move on to emerging technologies and AI. I think the first, number one, when people talk about AI, it's really kind of like a buzzword. It's really hard to say, are you talking about the algorithm? Are you talking about the technology itself? Or are you talking about a certain application? It's really unclear when people start talking about AI, what are they actually referring to? But one thing everyone knows is that you need a lot of data to be able to train that algorithm to become a successful AI. But what people often forget is the quality of AI, the quality of that data is also very important for any AI application. So looking at Taiwan, it's a relatively small economy, of course, compared to the US, to China, to India. But that doesn't mean Taiwan doesn't have any advantage in AI. And for example, actually like our companies like Google and IBM, they just built their AI R&D center in Taipei like last year. So definitely Taiwan have, advantages in this space. But I think what Taiwan needs to do is they really need to find that special niche and pursue a specialization in AI application because that is the way to succeed. For example, like small countries like Singapore, they focus a lot more on the financial aspect of AI. And in Europe, they focus a lot more on the transparency, accountability mechanism. What is a human ethical impact about AI? And in China, they focus a lot on facial recognition. In Japan, they focus a lot on healthcare. So what is that area that Taiwan wants to actually devote their energy and resources into? I don't have the answer yet, but I think that will be really crucial for Taiwan to find out what that is. So that's my second point on emerging technology. And the second point under emerging technologies that when we talk about AI, IoT, quantum computing, cloud, currently there's not a lot of clear answers and definitions in those areas, and a lot of regulatory policy are just start emerging. So this actually would be a perfect time for Taiwan to go sit at the table and to kind of share that their expertise and figure out what those definitions are. For example, in the ISO IEC, the international standards body, they just start talking about what's some of the regulation around AI look like. what does it mean to have cloud? How can we regulate a cloud? And at the OECD level, they just talked about some of the AI policy principle. How can we make sure human is always a part of the AI thinking? And looking back in Asia, in APAC, people are just starting to talk about what are some of the cybersecurity best practices that should be built in to IoT devices. So a lot of those discussions are still very new and just start emerging. And I think it would be really important for Taiwan to make sure it has a seat at the table and contribute meaningfully to those emerging discussions, to shape that discussion of the future. So that's my the second policy area. And the next policy area I want to talk about is privacy. Taiwan actually has passed a privacy protection law. It's called the Personal Data Protection Act, probably like a few years ago. And also Taiwan in December 2018, they also joined this so-called the APEC CBPR program. It's the cross-border privacy rule. This is pretty much like a privacy certification framework among the Asia-Pacific region that government-led, but companies agree to adopt them. So Taiwan actually is one of the few Asian countries that actually sign up to it. Currently, if you look at the world, there are not a lot of countries that actually have a privacy protection regime, and Taiwan is actually a few of them. So a privacy regime is good for consumer because when consumers go online and use those technologies, they know their data is being protected. If there's any problem, they can just go online and then redress, and they know their privacy rights are being protected in that way. They know that their data is not being compromised. So it's good for consumer. And from business side of things, it's also good because when consumer put their trust in this technology, potentially you can have the opportunity for company to innovate such technology and make it even more convenient for users. So it's definitely a win-win solution. And Taiwan actually has, very good privacy rule in place that actually make itself stand out compared to other Asian countries. So let's take a step back out of Asia. When we talk about privacy, everyone will agree that the European GDPR, the General Data Privacy Rule, is like the gold standard, it's the highest privacy standard around the world now. And currently, they are trying to figure out what are some of the interoperabilities for privacy rules to the Asia regions right now. And Taiwan actually is one of the few countries that already have APEC CBPR program. They should really start being a thought leader to figure out how can they bridge the gap to make sure we have a harmonized privacy regimes around the world. So this is still an area very new. People are just start discussing this, but Taiwan is really very well positioned to be that kind of thought leaders in the world as well. And particularly one thing to mention, the Japan and EU, they just reached their privacy adequacy decision last year. And I think Taiwan is one of the few Asian countries too to potentially seek that kind of adequacy decision with Europe and potentially create another mechanism to have a privacy data transfer mechanism with the US as well. So that's privacy. And the last policy area I want to talk about is digital trade. So when we talk about digital trade, there's this new saying that data is the new oil, and whoever controls more data is gonna win, is gonna be more powerful. I think that's like a very good analogy. But unfortunately, there are a lot of countries around the world, they just start implementing this data localization requirement. They just think they can just put a custom at the border so their data will not flow out of the border and they can take the best advantage out of that. So for that, it's unfortunate to hear that because, if the data cannot flow freely across the border, potentially a lot of good solutions that rely on data is not going to be able to generate that good solutions that's important to humankind. For example, like identify financial fraud, healthcare system, it will like slow down, the potential to find a solution for that if you just, creating a trade barriers on data. So at the WTO level, and Taiwan is a member of WTO, they are having this e-commerce initiative right now to discuss how can we not have trade barriers on data? How can we make sure data can really flow freely across border? How can we have good digital trade, agreements among countries. And Taiwan is actually definitely understand the importance of data flows, and they actually have good technology policy in place. They should really go and be an active player to promote good digital trade best practices. For example, like the US and Japan, they just have a digital trade agreement reached last year. And for example, like the USMCA also have very good digital trade chapters and languages. So how can Taiwan take those good digital trade practices and promote that in its own like kind of free trade agreement or its FTAs, or potentially trying to find opportunities to sign digital trade agreement with the US, Japan, or Europe, or other countries as well would be really important. So just to sum up what I just said, I think there are 4 policy areas where Taiwan and US and the world can have more opportunities for cooperations. And they are cybersecurity, emerging technologies, privacy, and digital trade. So I really hope Taiwan can really start being an active player on the global stage in the ICT space to make sure they grab that opportunity and just go for it. So for that, I will give the floor back to Evan, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks. So we'll open it up, but before we do, I just want to reinforce one thing that Alexa said. I think one of the themes that came up persistently as we discussed this set of issues with stakeholders both in Taiwan and the US, it was that the key for Taiwan is to emphasize and leverage the things that are unique and special to Taiwan. In other words, to be a standard setter, to focus on the quality rather than the quantity of data. I have a colleague who compares data to labor. If you think about labor, you can say, one advantage in a labor market is quantity of labor. But that's not the end of the story of a labor market. It's not just about quantity of labor. In a labor market, often it's about the quality of labor, the skilling of the labor, the way you leverage and use the labor, how flexible the labor market is. And the same could be said of data as well. So mainland China has scale advantages in terms of data. The United States has some scale advantages in terms of quantity of data. Taiwan, as I said when we were talking about the challenges, has smaller scale, but it can lever, as in my labor market analogy, the quality of the data, the governance of the data, the way it sets standards and then leverages and exports its standards on the regional and global stage, including through organizations that it's a member of. It's an APEC economy. It's a WTO member, in ways that would really leverage Taiwan's unique strengths and work to its advantage over time. So we have one example in there, but we talk about data. In mainland China, you have a lot of access actually to government data, but the quality of the data is pretty low. In the United States, there's less access to government data, but the quality of the data is pretty high. And so we said, Taiwan's comparative advantage could be to leverage both of those, right? To have open access to data, including public sector data, but high quality data, and then to lever that in ways that are useful to global companies, are useful in terms of data protections, data standards. And there's some other examples in here too. But the point is, I think thinking out of the box in this way and trying to leverage strengths that are unique to Taiwan, that's really the play that we keep coming back to. It's not to try to out-US the US or out-China China. It's really to take what's special and unique about Taiwan and lever those strengths ultimately as a standard-setting economy in ways that would redound to Taiwan's benefit over time. All right, so with that, I hope you'll all read the paper, but we were hoping for a discussion with all of you, so we'll just open it up. Please start with Mike.
I'm Mike Nelson. I'm here at the Carnegie Endowment. This is a rather general question, but I've been to Taiwan a few times over the last 20 years, and I noted 20 years ago there was huge tech enthusiasm, just as there was here. By 10 years ago, it's a little bit more measured. In the US, we're now in the deep depths of techlash. Technology is the source of all things bad. Is that happening today in Taiwan, and is that discouraging people from going into the tech sector and pursuing engineering jobs or making investments in tech as opposed to some other field?
Yeah, I understand your questions on techlash, but I think for now in Taiwan, people still look at tech relatively positive. And in fact, I think President Tsai's policy, like Evan mentioned, like the 5+2 and the Asian Silicon Valley Initiative, is kind of giving young people a new idea that it's not too bad to go to do startups. And if you ask someone 10 years ago, they will probably be like, their parents will probably tell their kids, no, don't go to startups. You go to like big technology companies in Taiwan. Give you a better job. With secure salary, things like that. But now, because of those policies actually having an impact on young people, they know that if you go to a good school in Taiwan, a lot of this policy have the incubators in those very good technology program in those universities is actually encouraging young people to take more STEM education, be a major in computer science, is starting to have an effect. And I see that more young people are willing to go to startup compared to 10 years ago. So I think, relatively speaking, I think it's still very positive. I know that, for example, like in Japan, they probably, the startup culture is a little bit different. People were still thinking more traditionally about you should go to big companies, but I don't think that's the case for Taiwan, because I think they are still, very active and wanted to be participating more. So I think it's a good start, but time will tell whether the policy actually is effective or not.
I'd flag a few issues in addition to that. One of the people that was in the group that we convened said that in many ways Taiwan is a victim of its own success. That companies like TSMC and MediaTek had been so successful, so special, and so unique that they still had basically soaked up a disproportionate share of the trained engineers in Taiwan. And so because they pay well, because they're stable, successful, important jobs that are central to the future of Taiwan's economy, actually there had not been a lot of risk-taking behavior, particularly by next-generation talent, to go off and work in startups. So that's one structural challenge, which is Taiwan's been so successful that in many ways it's a victim of its own success. Okay, then on top of that, you have a few other layers of challenge. One is brain drain, rather than brain circulation, essentially brain drain, to the other side of the Taiwan Strait. There's a figure in here. I don't want to quote the statistic because I don't want to quote it wrong, but a very large number of talented engineers from Taiwan are actually working on the other side of the Taiwan Strait now. And that's a problem if you think about the incubation of domestic industries at home. Third, I mentioned this PwC startup survey. It's a very interesting survey because they surveyed the founders of a large number of startup firms in all different industries. I flagged the educational backgrounds of the founders, but it also points to some structural challenges facing startups. One is they're disproportionately focused on the domestic market. But it was, as I said, internationalization that was so successful. So one challenge is how to marry this extremely dynamic, vibrant startup sector in Taiwan, which is incontestable. And the fact that actually there's a lot of VC money floating around in Taiwan. But a lot of it is going to firms that are not international in orientation, or there's Taiwan VC money actually going somewhere else outside of Taiwan. So those are some things that better public-private partnerships, better and different policy enhancements, public incentives, and changes in kind of the educational composition of the workforce could be designed to alleviate over time. So those are the kinds of things that I think are challenges, but there are actually a lot of interesting startup initiatives in Taiwan. There's this thing we mentioned called the Startup Stadium. There's this thing called AppWorks. They basically function as incubators or accelerators for companies. And a lot of the most successful Taiwan companies actually are forming privately sponsored accelerators and incubators, including university-based incubators. So we looked at some ways to marry that up with the industries that have been identified in the 5+2 Industries Plan. That's part of the challenge that they're going to have going forward. And we have some ideas, I think, for how US-Taiwan partnerships could also do that as well. Does that make sense? Great, thanks. Ken, and then we'll come around, please.
Ken Lieberthal of Brookings. The mainland has really made a major effort over recent years to be very actively engaged in standard setting, and for obvious reasons, but they're playing a big role there. The U.S., if anything, has been criticized for not taking that seriously enough. My assumption is the standards the mainland is promoting in a lot of these areas are not exactly the standards that Taiwan would be promoting. how much of a role can Taiwan play given the mainland's resources and enormous focus on shaping international standards in these technology areas?
You want to take that because it gets at some of the standard setting bodies?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of concern about, like, in the technology space, people are talking about, oh, the Chinese are, writing a lot of standards in those international standards body. But I think one thing also to emphasize is that, yes, maybe they are creating a lot of standards, domestically for themselves, but also maybe internationally. But the quantities of standard doesn't necessarily mean they produce good standards that will be adopted and accepted by all international players. So, for example, U.S. companies are still going to the standard bodies meeting, and they're still trying to discuss and forge a consensus with all the partners as well. So, whatever, if the Chinese standard is not good enough to be accepted, they won't be accepted. And what we don't want is that we definitely want Chinese to be a part of this international process to make sure they don't go home and create their unique standards that's totally not interoperable with anyone else. So I think the quality questions is also very important to look at when we talk about Chinese activities in the standards world.
Yeah, see, I think there's a lot, this is an interesting question because I think there's a lot of industry variance and industry-specific specificity to it. So if you look at, like, I've spent a lot of my time in my career looking at things that would be implicated by the Belt and Road, for example. I used to be a US official. I worked on Central Asia. I worked on South Asia. One of the most interesting effects of the Belt and Road, particularly for big things like power generation, is because China builds it, or a Chinese firm builds it, China Construction, Sino Hydro. When they build it to a Chinese standard, a mainland Chinese standard, right, a People's Republic of China standard. So essentially, one of the interesting implications of something like the Belt and Road is China can export its indigenous engineering standards and make them default regional and global engineering standards simply because it's combining sheer market power. It's deploying these technologies to scale like no other economy with the export role, right? So when you combine that, take something like hydropower, right? They built all these dams domestically. Now I think Sino Hydro does something like 54% of dams globally. That's incredible. So you leverage your domestic scale to become the standard setter, right? But that's in things like power generation or hydropower. Now think about some of the things that are AI enabled or cyber enabled, where frankly multinational companies and a lot of governments around the world don't want to rely on Chinese standards, don't trust Chinese technology. And that's not just a function of the trade war. There's a national security component, there's an industrial policy component, there's a political risk component, which is being exacerbated every day and is being stressed. You see it in every statement by a US official. And so this comes up a lot in this paper because frankly, at a time when there are a lot of governments and G7 or OECD economies that regard mainland Chinese standards as less trustworthy, Taiwan has a potential opportunity to, as I said, and we emphasize that adjective, trust, become the trusted vendor, the trusted tester, the trusted standard setter. But I would be looking not at some of the big ticket infrastructure things where China's basically exporting its technology, but things that are AI and cyber enabled, where there's going to be a premium on the kinds of things that Taiwan can offer. That begin with institutions, regulatory structures, legal environment, openness of the economy. And those are things that American firms, American government actually would find very appealing in Taiwan. It's one reason why I think you mentioned Qualcomm, Microsoft, Intel, a lot of these companies making new R&D investments in Taiwan. That's precisely why that's happening. And you can see it. You mentioned healthcare, for instance. Taiwan has an incredibly high quality healthcare system. Japan is making a lot of investments in AI-enabled healthcare. You can imagine that being a comparative advantage for Taiwan, where it can leverage both its healthcare system, the openness of it, cyber protections, and the quality of its data in a way that makes it essentially a trusted standard setter around AI-enabled healthcare applications. So I think that's a long way of saying it depends on the industry, but it's not just about quantity, and there is a very unique play potentially for Taiwan. Sure, please.
David Brown from SAIS. Hi, Evan. Thank you both for helping me understand a subject that I'm not familiar with. I have a question about education. and I very much understand your focus on the STEM first degree holders. But I think if I heard you correctly, you said that many of the startups are in fact being founded by people who have degrees in social sciences and marketing and so forth.
Liberal arts and marketing. Liberal arts and marketing.
Okay. If that's the case, why just focus on the STEM people? Why not having is there a role for facilitating the people with non-STEM degrees from playing more of a role in this area?
I can. It's
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's an important point. I think we focused on STEM because a lot of these future industrial standards are going to be decided essentially around research questions and applications from data science and computer science. And also because the overhang of this liberal arts legacy in the startup sectors, you have a lot of retail and consumer-focused startups in Taiwan. So you had this problem of emerging industries that required certain sets of engineering skills where there's a gap. And then you had the startup sector in Taiwan not really filling that gap because of legacy issues, but also because of this educational qualification requirement question. But that doesn't mean that set of skills is irrelevant. And there's a set of recommendations here around marrying business training with technical training. So we recommended, for instance, there's a set of recommendations here around training in business operations for graduates of technical schools and technical and engineering subjects, and vice versa. And it doesn't have to be PhD degrees in data sciences. It could just be basic skill sets that incorporate insights from the data sciences into a different business. But ultimately, we were focused on STEM because we were focused on how Taiwan changes its industrial mix from these legacy industries to future-facing industries. So it wasn't just for us. I mean, I think it wasn't just about liberal arts versus engineering. It's also the kind of engineering. And so there's a chart in here that actually breaks down engineering degrees. And as I said, it's not a surprise that disproportionately you see electrical and mechanical engineering because that's what's relevant to semiconductors, chip design. But the problem is if you think about some of the industries of the future, that's not the even within engineering, that's not the engineering workforce you need. I'd make one other point, which is that another potential comparative advantage Taiwan is bilingual education. So essentially to leverage English language to become a truly bilingual economy in a way that would distinguish Taiwan from other economies in the Asia-Pacific region. There's been a lot of talk about that in Taiwan. There's steps toward making Taiwan a genuinely bilingual economy, a genuinely bilingual place, and you can see how that could have really important effects in terms of comparative advantage and competitiveness. So consider, for instance, even engineering education. To be an English language enabled engineering education hub in Taiwan would make Taiwan very attractive as an educational destination for students from all over the world who are not just going to Australia, the UK, the United States, and so on. So marrying English language, business operations training, and technical training together in creative and interesting ways, that's some of the challenge that we thought Taiwan's government could rise to. Now, and the US can play a particularly important role on that as well. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just emphasize the importance of English language skill. Like the language skill is very important because, for example, when the Taiwanese startup, when they start, build up, the program and things, they often just look at Taiwan itself as a market skill because they don't necessarily think about, oh, your product can potentially be used in US or UK because without that language skill, they don't necessarily have a bigger ambition and to better position themselves to have global opportunities. Whereas in startups in Israel, when they figure out their plan, when they start building their product, they already think about how can we sell this product to US or other bigger markets outside of Israel. And I think because they traditionally have a really good language and bilingual kind of culture in itself as well. So that will be a key to help Taiwanese startups think globally and have bigger market size in that way. So I think that's definitely a key.
Hi, I'm Mickey Song, and I'm an intern of U-America Foundation. And what situation or what element made the EU GDPR like a global gold standard despite of the techno-nationalism around the world? And do you think that EU GDPR can be successful global standard that every country should comply with?
Should take that.
So that is a very good question. I think it's just the fact that the European GDPR was effective May 2018. It has a lot of good privacy sinking into the modern digital economy. For example, if you're a consumer, you have individual rights. You have the right to address, redress, your right to be forgotten. There's a lot of the data collection and the processing practices are good for the digital economy, and they pretty much already is the highest standard in the world for sure. That's and the thing is that the big companies pretty much have no problem complying with them because they can just hire a bunch of privacy lawyers, like a privacy army. But what is hard is the small companies, they may not have that amount of resources to have put in that much of resources to make their privacy program strong. But no matter what, the GDPR is the gold standard in the world. That's nothing to question. And on the question whether that should be replicated to other countries, it depends on whether the country feel like they are ready to have such a strong privacy protections. But I would do say that, for example, in Asia, Japan has a good privacy protection because they think their privacy standard is pretty much already interoperable with the EU system. So for Taiwan, it's also having its comprehensive privacy rules. It's a member of APEC CBPR. Are they ready to identify some of the gaps with the Europe GDPR program and potentially seek that kind of adequacy decision with EU? I think that would let themselves to decide. So,
how many economies have adequacy decisions now from the EU?
not a lot. So US have this privacy shield agreement with Europe, and Argentina and Canada are the other two big economy has. I think New Zealand also has one. I think in Asia, only Japan and New Zealand are the one currently have. And Korea is considering it for now.
So, and the point of an adequacy decision is you are certified by Brussels as having an adequate level of data protection and thereby get access to European data so you can globalize your access to data. So that's something we recommended in here for Taiwan because it's a way to basically create a new set of global connections for Taiwan, but in this case, leveraging Europe. Yes.
Hi, Bill Thiel. I have a kind of a political question here. Let's assume that Taiwan reaches a point where it's beginning to produce competitive products and getting them accepted in other markets. And China sees this happening and compels the recipient countries to choose Taiwan and China for trade benefits and so forth. Do you see that kind of a scenario working out? Do you see China having the leverage, the ability to do that sort of thing? And what would Taiwan be able to do to work around that?
Well, first of all, Taiwan is producing competitive products for other markets. It's one of the most competitive economies in the world already. So that's true in a whole variety of industries. Second, a lot of these supply chains are integrated across the Taiwan Strait. Third, I think, frankly, the growing distrust of China is an opportunity for Taiwan, and that's a point I made earlier, and it's a point we make in here. But we make it more as a technological point than just as a political point, although they're connected, right? The lack of trust in China-origin technology is related to political risk, national security issues. That's what you see playing out on 5G, AI, in the US-China relationship and some of the European relationships with Chinese firms and so on. So the question is how Taiwan positions itself in that. And that's an opportunity for Taiwan. And there's no question that the political risk is there. But the real core questions are the technological and regulatory ones. Is Taiwan prepared to leverage the strengths that it really has? Openness, quality of data, strong regulatory institutions, rule of law, its democratic institutions, it's the trust that other economies have in it, in a way that would make it attractive. In a lot of these industries, it doesn't have to be zero-sum across the Taiwan Strait, but often it will be on things like who do you trust to do the testing? Who do you trust for cyber-enabled applications? And there, I mean, I think the questions are really policy questions for Taiwan, but those are things that more US-Taiwan partnerships could be helpful to. And to answer your very direct question very directly, our view is that the United States should be pursuing those kinds of partnerships with Taiwan, and Taiwan in turn should be pursuing those with the United States. And these are different legs of basically an innovation strategy for Taiwan, but also for the US-Taiwan relationship. There's a lot being made now, for instance, of a trade agreement, essentially a US-Taiwan free trade agreement. And my view is that the time has never been better for that, because the will is there in Taiwan to do things that are hard, but where the will wasn't necessarily there in the past. But as we say in the conclusion to this, a trade agreement alone doesn't position Taiwan necessarily for success in a lot of these future-facing industries, in part because a trade agreement would be focused on legacy industries in some ways, although it would have e-commerce chapters and so on. So you need multiple legs to this, and that's what this paper was really focused on. Does that make sense? Okay. Others?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Chang from the Global Taiwan Institute, and I have a question for Alexa. You mentioned that Taiwan should strive to be a cybersecurity leader in Asia, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what are Taiwan's comparative advantages in cybersecurity. And then you also mentioned some of the applications of that, which would be, you mentioned cybersecurity training in Southeast Asia. I was wondering how can Taiwan specifically contribute towards I guess cybersecurity issues in Southeast Asia?
Sure, yeah. So I think when I talk about how Taiwan can position itself to be a cybersecurity leader in Asia is because it has a lot of knowledge and expertise dealing with cyber attack from mainland China on a day-to-day basis. And particularly, each country has this mechanism called CERT. It's a Cyber Emergency Response Team. So each country have this kind of team to deal with cyber attack when something happens. So potentially with Taiwan's day-to-day experiences and knowledge with that, it can potentially do a lot of exercise, CERT and CERT to CERT cooperation with other nations in Asia Pacific region. So Taiwan can definitely take that leadership and voluntarily go to like-minded country and have those exercise. And then for your questions on Southeast Asia, I think it just like the U.S. is thinking about how can they increase its U.S. technology export to the Southeast Asian region, and Taiwan is also looking at this new southbound policy to go into gaining their influence into that region as well. And then on the technology front, for Southeast Asian country, they don't necessarily have like the big Amazon, Facebook, or Google. They're just really start thinking about how can we even have a tech industry for ourselves? That very basic questions like that. So a basic cybersecurity training, technology or system, how do they even build their AI R&D program? Where do they put that resource into? Like basic questions like that. I think the US and Taiwan can brainstorm together and potentially deepen the ties in that area.
Hi, I'm Tim White with the Mansfield Foundation. I noted several times you mentioned areas where the Taiwanese and US governments can work closer together on developing policies and strategies together. I noticed also that you have one person from AIT on your group and several people with varying degrees of connection to the Taipei government. In their opinion, is there enough communication going on between Washington and Taipei on the government level to meet the needs that you highlight in that government-to-government field? And if not, do they have any ideas on how that can be enhanced?
Well, I don't want to speak for them, but yeah, I think there are a lot of areas in which basically the governments in Washington and Taipei could enhance communication and actually coordination. One example we give in here is regulatory frameworks. The more the US and Taiwan can concert regulatory frameworks, the more they'd be in a position both to be in harmony, which enables more investment, but also then to become joint standard setters around regulatory issues in the APEC context, for example. So we use that as an example. There are also there's some discussion in here of university-based partnerships. So there are both official and unofficial vehicles there to facilitate educational exchanges. we talk about some vehicles where different stakeholders could come together in an advisory capacity, essentially a trans-Pacific advisory panel that would bring industry, R&D, capital markets, and yes, some regulatory players together. So without speaking for AIT, I think the point is that there are lots of opportunities around areas that governments can affect, like regulation and regulatory issues. And the sky's the limit on some of that. I think the first challenge is to get those things concerted in a way that allow the United States to basically work with Taiwan in a broader regional and global context. If you look at things like the AmCham in Taiwan says, you look at their white papers, there's lots of recommendations along that. We were trying to focus on things that other people had not. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's perfect.
Right. Others before we call time, please.
Emma Raphaeloff. I work with Alexa at ITI.
Okay.
And I noticed that this is the first in kind of like a series of papers you'll explore, I think kind of related to the last gentleman's question. Just sort of a thought or a question about the remainder of the series. And I know it's focused a lot on US and Taiwan, kind of continuing to develop the partnership and how to also influence that from the US side. But some of the points that you both made throughout and also that are contained in the report, the extent to which Taiwan also can work with other governments in Southeast and kind of Northeast Asia. Hopefully, I don't know what thought you've given to kind of expanding on that a little bit more in terms of different partnerships and other recommendations with those governments. Since I think that's an important part of the piece as things in Washington continue to be relatively uncertain and moving and tenuous in terms of how procedure will go. There's still lots of opportunity, aside from just working with the United States.
Sure, and I mean, that's why the paper talks about, it isn't just about Taiwan. One part of it is about innovation strategy in Taiwan. Another part of it is where Taiwan-US partnerships can slot in. And then Taiwan is a member of APEC, Taiwan is a member of the WTO. We talk about those contexts, which get you into the global piece. We talk about Europe and GDPR. We talk about Southeast Asia and so on. My suspicion is that'll be replicated everywhere we go. The next piece of this project is on energy, taking a look at security, affordability, sustainability, not just in terms of fuel mix, but in terms of what Taiwan's energy future scenarios look like. We're doing that again in partnership with the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research, but also another think tank in Taiwan as well. And we're going to continue to replicate that in some other areas as well. So it's an intrinsic part of the conversation. Do you want to add anything?
No, that's perfect.
All right. Any last words from anybody? All right, well, I'm really glad you came out. I hope you'll read the paper. I hope you'll read the next papers in the series. We're excited about it. And particularly what I'm excited about it is I think these are serious issues of public policy, both within Taiwan and for the US and Taiwan to collaborate and cooperate on. And so it's a highly prescriptive, really policy-focused report. It's not pitched at 100,000 feet. You may find it a little weedy in places, but that's good. I mean, that's how better policies develop. And we did it through a partnership that brought government, capital markets, industry together, which is a nice model because if you want to talk about public policy in the economy or on things like regulation, you have to involve industry and capital markets in some way. So we'll see how this evolves over time. But as I said, this is part of an effort that we have here at Carnegie to not just look at 100,000 feet and not just look at the Asia-Pacific region in terms of security dynamics, but in other dynamics as well. And we're really glad we got Alexa and others involved. I'm glad you came over to
The great
help give your
journey,
views.
the very interesting report.
So thanks for coming out. Please read the paper, and you'll see some subsidiary pieces that come off this as well. So please, sure. Yes. Yeah, we're going to try to do the next, so we're trying to focus on different areas, as I said, that really cut at the core of Taiwan's future competitiveness. And if you go back to the way I started the talk today, I said, if you look at the 2019 data, and particularly at the fourth quarter of 2019 data, Taiwan's economy is doing pretty well, especially in comparison to other economies in the Asia-Pacific region. But having the right economy for right now doesn't necessarily mean you have the right economy for 10 to 15 years from now, given the degree of industrial evolution and technological change. So the premise of the project, which doesn't presuppose the findings, is that there are things that Taiwan and the US, Taiwan and others can do to position Taiwan to have the right economy, not just for right now, but for down the road. So the next thing in the series, we're gonna look at energy. But that doesn't mean we're done with innovation. Obviously, the goal was not to write a paper, drop it, and then walk away from it. So you'll see more on this too. But we wanted to look at different aspects of Taiwan's economic trajectory. So now that I've raised the bar, we'll have to have you back for now. We got to write another paper on energies. So anyway, thanks for coming out today. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.